In the center of the city, there stood a building that looked like a palace made of glass and gold. This was the conservatory, a school where only the most talented young musicians went to learn their craft. Inside, the air always smelled of expensive wood polish and old dust. The hallways were filled with the sound of violins singing, cellos humming, and pianos crashing like thunder. The students who walked here walked with their heads high. They wore fancy coats and carried instrument cases that cost more than some people earned in a year. They knew they were special. They wanted everyone else to know it too. But there was one person in this building who did not walk with her head high. Her name was Alina. Alina was the cleaner every day. While the sun was setting and the long shadows stretched across the marble floor, Alina would arrive for her shift. She wore a light blue uniform that was too big for her. The sleeves were a bit too long, hiding her wrists, and the hem dragged slightly on the ground. On her feet, she wore sturdy brown shoes that made a soft, squeaking sound when she walked. Over her hair, she wore a simple scarf, tied tight so not a single strand could escape. To the students and the teachers, Alina was invisible. She was part of the furniture, like the heavy velvet curtains or the brass coat racks. If a student walked past her, they wouldn't look at her face. They would just see a blur of blue moving out of the way. Sometimes they wouldn't even say, "Excuse me." They would just keep talking loudly about how hard their practice was or how expensive their new sheet music was. Alina would just step aside, holding her mop or her trash bag, and wait for them to pass. She never complained, and she never interrupted. Her job was hard work. She had to clean the huge lobby, where muddy boots tracked in dirt from the rainy streets outside. She had to wipe down the hundreds of doors that led to the practice rooms. She had to empty the trash cans, which were often filled with crumpled up, paper-failed attempts at writing songs, perhaps. It was lonely work. The building was so big that sometimes the echoes of her own footsteps were the only company she had. But Lena didn't mind the silence. In fact, she liked it. Because while she was cleaning, she was listening. The conservatory was a maze of sound. Every room had a piano, and almost every room was occupied. As Alina pushed her heavy cart down the long corridors, she would hear snippets of music drifting from under the doors. She would stop near room 104. Inside, a boy was practicing scales. Do-re-mi-fa-so-la-ti-do. He played them fast. Very fast. His fingers were like machine guns. He didn't miss a single note. Alina would lean on her mop handle and close her eyes for a second. She could hear that his fingers were strong, but the music sounded empty. It was like a robot typing on a keyboard. There was no feeling in it, no sadness, and no joy. It was just perfect notes. Then she would move to room 112. Here a girl was playing a very fast, angry piece. Alina could hear the girl stomping her foot on the floor. The music was loud and aggressive. The girl was clearly showing off, trying to prove she was the best player in the school. But to Alina, it just sounded like noise. It was a storm without any rain. It was all thunder and no lightning. This happened every single night. The students played to impress their teachers. They played to win competitions. They played to be better than the person in the room next door. But Alina never heard them play for the music itself. What the students didn't know was that Alina understood the language they were speaking better than they did. She knew music the way a sailor knows the sea. They saw a tired woman with rough hands and a bent back, scrubbing floors. They saw someone who probably didn't know the difference between a Beethoven and a Bach. They thought she was simple. But Alina had a secret locked deep inside her. A secret she hadn't told anyone in this city. Alina was born in a country far across the ocean. It was a place of great beauty, but also great danger. When Alina was a young woman, she wasn't a cleaner. She was a star. She grew up in a house where music was the food we ate. Her father was a musician, and he taught her to play the piano when she was so small her feet couldn't even touch the pedals. As she grew up, Alina fell in love with the piano. She didn't just play the notes. She felt them in her bones. When she played a happy song, she would smile so broadly her cheeks hurt. When she played a sad song, she would cry real tears. People came from all over to hear her play. She played in big concert halls just like this one. She wore long, sparkling dresses. People used to throw flowers onto the stage for her. She had power when she sat at the piano. She could make a whole room of strangers hold their breath. But life is unpredictable. Trouble came to her country. There was fighting and shouting in the streets. It became unsafe for people like Alina, people who loved art and beauty. She had to make a terrible choice. She had to leave everything behind to stay alive. She left her big house. She left her friends. She even left her piano. She came to this new city as a refugee. She didn't speak the language well. Her diplomas and her awards were useless pieces of paper in a place where nobody knew her name. She needed money to eat. She needed a roof over her head. So, she took the only job she could find. She became a cleaner. It had been 20 years since Alina last touched a piano key. 20 years. Sometimes when she walked past the shiny grand pianos in the rehearsal rooms, her fingers would twitch. It was a muscle memory, a ghost feeling. She would look at the black and white keys and remember how they felt, cool and smooth. She remembered the weight of the keys, how they pushed back against her fingers. But she never sat down. She was afraid. She was afraid that if she sat down, she would realize she had forgotten everything. She was afraid that her hands, now rough and dry from cleaning chemicals, were too clumsy to play. She was afraid that the magic she had as a young woman had died inside her, just like her old life had. So, she kept the door closed. She chose to be invisible. It was safer that way. One evening, the rain was pouring hard outside. It was a Tuesday, late in the autumn. The hallways were quiet because most of the students had gone home for dinner. Alina was in the main lobby, mopping up a puddle of dirty water that someone had tracked in. The sound of a piano drifted down from the grand staircase. It was coming from the main concert hall. Alina stopped mopping. She listened. It was Chopin and Nocturne. It was a piece that was supposed to be gentle and romantic. It's like a lullaby. But the student playing it was making it sound like a math problem. He was hitting every note correctly, but he was rushing. He wasn't giving the music any room to breathe. It sounded stiff and dead. Alina sighed. She leaned her mop against the wall and walked closer to the source of the sound. She stood at the huge double doors of the concert hall. They were slightly open. Through the crack, she could see a young man sitting at a massive black grand piano. He was swaying his head back and forth, clearly very impressed with himself. Alina watched him. She wanted to walk in and tell him to slow down. She wanted to tell him that the music wasn't a race to the finish line. She wanted to tell him to listen to the silence between the notes. "You're playing it all wrong," she whispered to herself in the empty hallway. Her voice sounded rusty. She felt a sudden sharp pain in her chest. It wasn't a heart attack. It was a pang of longing. It was a hunger that she had been pushing down for 20 years. She looked at her hands. They were red from the hot water and the soap she used to scrub the floors. Her fingernails were cut short. "Those aren't pianist's hands anymore," she told herself. "Those are cleaner's hands." She turned away from the door. She grabbed her mop and went back to the puddle on the floor. She pushed the mop back and forth, trying to scrub the sound of the piano out of her mind. But the music stayed with her. It always did. For years, Alina had convinced herself that she didn't need music anymore. She told herself that her job was enough, that watching other people play was enough. But as she stood there in the empty, golden lobby, looking at her reflection in the glass window, she knew it wasn't true. The music was still inside her. It was sleeping, but it was not dead. And something deep down told her that it wouldn't sleep forever. The time was coming when the invisible woman would have to be seen. The air inside the music school changed as the month of October turned into November. The easygoing feeling of the new semester vanished, replaced by a tense, heavy atmosphere. It was time for the Golden Key Showcase. This was the biggest event of the year for the students. It was a competition where only one winner would get a full scholarship to a famous academy in Europe. For the young musicians, this wasn't just a prize. It was their future. Winning meant they were set for life. Losing meant they were just another person with talent but no opportunity, because the stakes were so high. The practice rooms became battlegrounds. The students stopped talking to each other in the hallways. If someone passed another student carrying a violin case, they would look straight ahead, pretending the other person didn't exist. There were no more smiles. It's only nervous whispers and dry throats. Alina watched this change happen from her usual spot in the shadows. As she emptied the trash bins in the corridors, she saw the fear in the students' eyes. She saw them walking with their shoulders hunched up tight. She heard the panic in their voices when they thought they had made a mistake. It made her sad. To her, music was supposed to be a joy, a way to let your spirit fly. But for them, it had become a heavy burden. They were like horses forced to run a race with no end in sight. Carrying the weight of everyone's expectations on their backs, there was one student who was affected more than the others. His name was Victor. Victor was a pianist, and everyone knew he was the best the school had. He was tall and thin, with pale skin and dark circles under his eyes from lack of sleep. He practiced for 6, sometimes 7 hours a day, but his playing wasn't getting better. It was getting worse. He was trying so hard to be perfect that he had lost all the emotion in his music. He played the notes like he was hammering nails into a wall. One Tuesday afternoon, the stress finally boiled over. Alina was in the main concert hall. This was the biggest room in the building, a beautiful space with velvet seats and a huge crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling. She was on her hands and knees near the back rows, polishing the brass railings that ran along the seats. The smell of the metal polish was sharp and stung her nose a little, but Alina liked the shiny look it left behind. The hall was empty, or so she thought. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the back swung open and banged against the walls with a loud crash. Alina jumped slightly. She looked up and saw Victor storming down the center aisle. He wasn't walking. He was stomping. His face was bright red, and his hair was messy, sticking up in all directions. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. He marched right up to the stage where the biggest piano in the school sat. It was a massive 9-foot concert, grand, black and shiny as a mirror. Victor threw his sheet music onto the music rack. The papers fluttered and slid off, scattering onto the floor. He didn't even care. He sat down on the bench, lifted the lid to reveal the keys, and immediately began to play. He didn't start with a warm-up. He started with the loudest, most difficult part of his competition piece. It was a thunderous storm of a song. He was hitting the keys so hard that Alina could feel the vibrations in the floor under her knees. It wasn't music. It was an explosion. He was angry at the piano. He was angry at the competition. He was angry at himself. Alina stayed perfectly still, watching him. She didn't dare move. She knew that look in his eyes. He was looking for a way out, but he couldn't find it. Suddenly, in the middle of a loud crashing chord, there was a sickening sound. Twang. It wasn't a musical note. It was the sound of wood and metal snapping. Victor's hands flew off the keys. He sat there, breathing hard, staring at the piano. One of the thick bass strings inside the piano had broken. It lay limp, coiled like a dead snake. The sound that came out of the piano now was dull and thud. Victor let out a scream of pure frustration. He stood up, kicked the piano bench hard, and sent it sliding across the polished wooden stage. Then he stormed off the stage, right past Alina, without even seeing her there. He pushed through the double doors and vanished into the hallway. Leaving the sheet music scattered like fallen leaves, the concert hall went silent. Alina stood up slowly. Her knees ached a little from crouching on the hard floor. She looked at the stage. It looked like a disaster zone. The piano was damaged. The bench was overturned. Paper was everywhere. She knew she should clean it up. That was her job. She walked down the aisle, her shoes squeaking softly in the vast silence. She climbed the steps to the stage and began to gather the sheet music. She stacked the papers neatly on the corner of the piano. Then she righted the bench, setting it back in its proper place. But she couldn't stop looking at the broken string. She knew what that meant. A broken string on a concert grand is a serious problem. You can't just tie it back together. The piano was now out of tune in a way that no one could play. The acoustic pressure was wrong. The next morning, Alina found out just how big of a problem it was. The head of the school, a stern man with gray hair, was standing in the lobby with several teachers. They were speaking in urgent whispers. Alina was dusting a nearby plant, trying to be invisible while she listened. "The tuner is out of town," the headmaster was saying, wringing his hands together. "He cannot be here until Friday morning. But the showcase is tomorrow night." A teacher cried out. "We cannot have the students perform on a broken instrument. The sound will be terrible for the judges. It will ruin the whole event. We'll have to postpone," another voice suggested. "We cannot postpone. The judges are flying in from overseas. The tickets are sold out. We must use that piano, or we have no show." They were stuck. It was a nightmare. Without the main piano, the showcase could not happen. The students would have nowhere to play. The school would be embarrassed. That evening, the sun went down and the school closed. The teachers went home to worry. The students went home to panic. The building was locked up, dark and quiet. Alina was the only one left. She had finished her regular rounds early. The classrooms were clean, the trash was empty, and the floors were shining. But she found herself walking back toward the main concert hall. She didn't have a cleaning cart with her. Her hands were empty, and they felt restless at her sides. She pushed open the heavy doors. The hall was dark, lit only by the moonlight streaming through the high windows. It looked magical and spooky at the same time. On the stage, the big black piano sat like a sleeping beast. Alina walked slowly up the aisle. She climbed the stairs and stood in front of the instrument. The top lid was still propped open, exposing the strings inside. In the dim light, she could see the broken bass string. It looked sad. She reached out. She didn't touch the keys. Instead, she touched the iron plate that held the strings. It was cold. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The smell of the wood and the dust filled her nose. It was a smell she knew better than anything else in the world. A thought popped into her head. A crazy, dangerous thought. I could fix it. Alina knew how to tune a piano. It wasn't part of her job description, and she had never done it professionally. But her father, who was also a musician, had taught her when she was a girl. He told her a pianist must understand the machine if they want to master the music. She knew how to use the tuning hammer. She knew how to listen for the beats in the sound waves to find the perfect pitch. She looked around the huge, empty room. The security cameras were positioned in the corners, but the lights were off in the hall. She was just a shadow. If she could fix the string, maybe the competition could be saved. It was the right thing to do. She left the stage for a moment and went to the small maintenance closet at the back of the hall. She knew the tuner kept his tools there. The door was locked, but the school had given her a master key years ago for emergencies. She opened it. Inside, on a small shelf, sat a tuning hammer and a set of pliers. Alina took them. Her hand was shaking slightly as she held the heavy metal tool. It felt foreign in her grip, yet familiar at the same time. She walked back to the stage. She sat down on the bench. She was so close to the keys now. Her hands were hovering just inches above them. For a second, she was terrified. She felt a strong urge to press one key just to hear the sound. But she resisted. She wasn't here to play. She was here to work. She leaned over the strings. She used the pliers to carefully remove the broken string and uncoil the new one from the spare pile the tuner kept. It was difficult work. Her fingers were stiff and the wire was sharp. She cut her finger slightly on a splinter of steel. A tiny drop of blood welled up. But she wiped it away on her uniform and kept going. She threaded the new string through the iron pins. She had to use the tuning hammer to tighten it. Click, click, click. The sound of the tool turning was loud in the silent hall. As she tightened the string, she realized she needed to check the pitch. She didn't have a tuning fork or an electronic app. She had to use her ears. She had to pull the sound from her memory. She had to hear the note of E in her mind before the string could sing it. Alina closed her eyes. She blocked out the world. She didn't think about the cleaning or the students or the floor that needed mopping. She thought only about the sound. She remembered the vibration of that note in her chest when she was young. She found the tone in her imagination. She struck the key gently. Thud. It was loose and flapping. She turned the hammer. A little tighter. She struck it again, bowing, getting closer. She listened intently, her face scrunched up in concentration. She was hunting for the pure, clean tone, the spot where the vibration stops fighting and just sings. For 20 minutes, she worked. She tuned the new string, then she tuned the strings around it to make sure they all liked each other. She was sweating now, despite the cold air in the hall. Her back ached from leaning over, but she didn't stop. Finally, she struck a chord. A rich, deep, rolling sound came out of the piano. It was warm. It was alive. The broken string was gone, replaced by a voice that was ready to sing. Alina let out a long breath. She sat up straight and rubbed her hands on her trousers. She looked at the tuning hammer in her hand and then placed it gently on the floor. She had done it. The piano was saved. But now that the work was done, the silence of the room felt different. It felt inviting. Alina looked at the black and white keys in front of her. They were so close. Her right hand rested on her lap. She curled her fingers. They felt stiff, but the itch was stronger than ever. The music inside her, the part she had locked away for 20 years, was banging on the door of her heart, begging to be let out. She looked at the empty hall. No one was there. No one would know. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and raised her hand. The concert hall was darker now, illuminated only by the pale blue glow of the moon filtering through the high arched windows. Dust motes danced in the faint light, looking like tiny silent spirits floating above the stage. Alina sat on the piano bench, her heart beating so hard she could hear it thumping in her ears like a drum. Her hands were resting on her knees. They felt heavy and rough, covered in the small scars and calluses earned from years of scrubbing floors and handling harsh cleaning chemicals. These were not the hands of a lady who wore silk gloves. These were workers' hands. She looked down at them and felt a sudden wave of shame. Who was she to think she could touch this instrument? This piano belonged to the students, to the young, talented people who had a future. She was just a ghost from the past, a woman who had hidden herself away for 2 decades. She told herself to stand up. She told herself to pick up her tools, walk out the heavy double doors, and go home to her small apartment. The piano was fixed. That was all that mattered. She had done her job, even if it wasn't in her job description, but her body did not listen to her mind. Her fingers twitched. It was a reflex, a deep memory buried in her muscles. They remembered the weight of the keys, the cool touch of the ivory, and the resistance of the strings. They remembered the joy slowly, almost as if an invisible string was pulling her arm. Alina lifted her right hand. It trembled in the air. The distance between her hand and the keyboard was only a few inches, but it felt like a mile. She held her breath. The air in the hall was stale and cold, but to her, it felt electric. Her pinky finger touched the keys first. Just a gentle tap. The sound was soft, a single high note that rang out into the silence. It was a pure, clear bell tone. The note lingered in the air, hanging there like a star. Alina didn't pull her hand away. She froze. She waited for the feeling of panic to come. But it didn't. Instead, a warm feeling washed over her. Starting in her chest and moving out to her fingertips, it felt like coming home after a very long, very hard journey. She pressed down another note, then a third. She began to play a simple melody. It was a lullaby, something her mother used to hum to her when she was a child. At first, her playing was stiff and hesitant. Her fingers felt rusty, like a hinge on a gate that hadn't been opened in years. They fumbled slightly on a turn, missing a note. Alina stopped. She pulled her hands back and clenched them into fists. "No," she whispered into the darkness. "You have forgotten. You are clumsy. You are nothing now." But as she spoke, the echo of the notes she had just played still hung in the air. They sounded sweet, even with the mistake. They sounded human. "Try again," a voice seemed to say in her head. It wasn't a scary voice. It was a gentle voice, the voice of the music itself. Alina relaxed her hands. She placed them back on the keys. She closed her eyes. She stopped trying to look at the black and white pattern. She stopped trying to think about what her fingers were doing. She started to feel. She began to play again, but this time, she didn't think about the notes. She thought about the memory of the lullaby. She thought about safety, about warmth, about love. Suddenly, the stiffness vanished. Her fingers, which had been curled tight like dried leaves, opened up. They found the notes without her eyes needing to guide them. The music began to flow like water breaking through a dam. The lullaby faded away, and a new melody took over. It was the third piano concerto by Rachmaninoff, a piece she knew better than she knew her own name. It was a stormy, passionate piece of music, full of sadness and triumph. Elena's left hand moved down to the low end of the keyboard, playing the heavy, rolling chords that supported the melody. The sound that came out of the piano was massive. It filled the entire hall, bouncing off the high ceiling and shaking the velvet seats. It wasn't the polite, careful playing of the students. It was big. It was bold. As she played, the janitor's uniform seemed to disappear. She wasn't Alina the cleaner anymore. She was a musician. Her posture changed. She sat up straighter, her body leaning into the piano, swaying with the rhythm. Her head tilted back slightly, her face turned toward the ceiling. The emotion she had kept bottled up for 20 years began to pour out of her. She played the anger she felt when she had to leave her country. She struck the keys hard, letting the piano roar her frustration. The notes crashed and thundered, echoing the sound of the war she had escaped. Then the music softened. She played the loneliness she felt living in a strange city where no one knew her. The melody became weeping and tender, crying out into the empty room. Tears began to stream down Elena's face, but she did not wipe them away. She let them fall onto her uniform. She didn't care. The tears were part of the music. Her hands, usually covered in rubber gloves, were flying over the keys now. They moved with a speed and grace that defied her age. They were doing things that seemed impossible for a woman who spent her days mopping floors. The intricate runs of notes, the scales, the arpeggios came rushing out. Her fingers danced with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of a poet. She reached the middle part of the song, where the music is fast and difficult. The notes were like a cascade of falling water. She didn't miss a single one. Her fingers knew exactly where to go. It was as if the 20 years of silence had never happened. It was as if her hands had been waiting all this time, just under the surface. Practicing in secret while she scrubbed floors, the piano was singing. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a living, breathing thing, and Alina was speaking through it. She was telling the story of her life without saying a single word. She was telling the story of the dreams she lost and the strength she found. Just to survive, the sound filled the conservatory. It drifted out through the vents and the cracks in the doors. It floated up the stairwells. If anyone had been walking by on the street outside, they would have heard the music soaring into the night sky. It was a sound that could stop traffic, sound that could make a stranger stop and weep. Inside the hall, Alina lost all track of time. She forgot where she was. She forgot that she was tired. She forgot that she was supposed to be invisible. There was only the music. It wrapped around her like a warm blanket. It filled the empty spaces in her heart. She played the climax of the piece. The music swelled, louder and louder, building up to a moment of pure power. Elena's hands were a blur. She threw her whole body into the chords, putting every ounce of energy she had left into the instrument. The sound was overwhelming, a wall of sound that felt like it could lift the roof off the building, and then silence. Elena's hands landed on the final chord, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. She held it, letting the sound fade away into nothingness. She sat there, her fingers pressed down on the keys, listening as the echo died out. When the last note was gone, the silence returned to the concert hall. But it wasn't an empty silence anymore. It was a heavy, charged silence, like the air after a lightning strike. The room felt different. It felt blessed. Alina opened her eyes. She was breathing hard, gasping for air as if she had just run a marathon. Her body was trembling all over. Sweat ran down the side of her face. She looked down at her hands. They were still resting on the keys. For a moment, she didn't recognize them. They looked different to her. They looked capable. They looked strong. Slowly, carefully, she lifted her hands off the piano. As soon as she let go, the magic seemed to break a little. The reality of the room came back to her. She saw the moonlight on the floor. She saw the dust. She heard the hum of the air conditioner. She stood up from the bench. Her legs felt shaky, like jelly. She took a step back and looked at the piano. It looked majestic and mysterious in the dark, she whispered aloud. Her voice sounded small and thin after the thundering music she had just created. I didn't know I still had that inside me. A wave of exhaustion hit her all at once. The adrenaline that had been fueling her began to fade, leaving her feeling empty and tired. She looked around the hall, making sure she was truly alone. The shadows in the corners were still. The doors were closed. It had been a secret moment, a gift she had given to herself. She felt a strange mix of guilt and peace. She knew she shouldn't have done it. It was dangerous to let the past out. But she also knew that she would never be able to truly silence it again. The music was awake now. Alina smoothed down her blue uniform. She picked up the tuning hammer and the pliers from the floor where she had left them. She looked at the piano one last time, almost as if she were saying goodbye to an old friend. She turned and walked slowly down the steps of the stage. Her squeaking shoes echoed in the hall, but the sound didn't bother her anymore. She walked up the long center aisle toward the exit. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. If she looked back, she might want to stay there forever. Trapped in the memory of the song, she pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the lobby. She closed the doors behind her, shutting the music inside. As she walked toward the closet to put away the tools, she wiped her face with her sleeve. Her face was wet with tears, but for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't crying because she was sad. She was crying because for a few glorious minutes, she had been alive again. She walked down the dark corridor, ready to clean the floors, but she carried a new, secret light in her heart. Asterisk, the sound of Elena's final chord had faded into the air. But the silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, filled with a kind of electric energy that made the skin prickle. Alina stood up from the piano bench, her legs feeling like they were made of jelly. Her heart was still racing, thumping against her ribs like a trapped bird. For a few wonderful moments, she had been someone else. She had been a virtuoso, a queen of the keys. But now, as the adrenaline wore off, the reality of the dark room came creeping back in. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling. She quickly pulled her sleeves down over her wrists, hiding the rough skin that had just produced such beautiful music. She felt a sudden spike of fear. What if someone had heard? What if a security guard had been walking by? She knew she wasn't supposed to be on the stage, and she certainly wasn't supposed to be playing the expensive instruments. If she got caught, she would lose her job. She grabbed the cleaning rag she had brought with her and the tuning hammer. Turning to leave the stage as quickly as her tired feet would carry her, she was halfway down the aisle, heading toward the safety of the exit doors when a noise stopped her cold. It wasn't the squeak of a shoe or the sound of the wind. It was the sound of hands clapping. Alina froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The sound was slow at first, just a single pair of hands striking together. Then it grew steadier. It was coming from the back of the hall, deep in the shadows. Panic rose in her chest. She spun around, clutching her rag to her chest like a shield. "Who is there?" she called out. Her voice sounded weak and shaky in the large room. From the darkness of the back vestibule, two figures stepped forward into the dim light of the emergency exit sign. Elena's stomach dropped. It was the head of the school, Mr. Sterling, and with him was the chairman of the board, a wealthy man named Mr. DuPont. They were both dressed in expensive suits. Looking out of place in the dusty, dark concert hall, Alina wanted the floor to open up and swallow her. She felt small and dirty in her oversized blue uniform. She instinctively stepped back, trying to hide in the shadows of the seats. I am sorry," she stammered, her words tumbling over each other. I was cleaning. I didn't mean to disturb you." Mr. Sterling didn't say a word. He just walked down the aisle, his eyes fixed on Alina. Mr. DuPont followed close behind him. They didn't look angry. They looked stunned. Their faces were pale, as if they had just seen a ghost. Alina shrank back against a velvet chair. She waited for them to yell. She waited for them to tell her she was fired for touching the piano. She bowed her head, preparing for the harsh words. "I will leave," she whispered. "I am sorry." But the words she expected never came. Instead, Mr. Sterling stopped a few feet away from her. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Alina," he said softly. He used her name. He never used her name. Usually, he just walked past her without even a nod. "Yes, sir," she whispered, still looking at the floor. "Alina," Mr. Sterling said again, his voice full of wonder. "What was that? What were you just playing?" Alina didn't know what to say. She couldn't lie, but she was terrified of the truth. It was just an old piece," she mumbled. "The piano had a broken string. I fixed it. I just wanted to see if it was okay." Mr. DuPont stepped forward. He was usually a serious man, a man who cared only about money and the reputation of the school. But now his eyes were wide. "Fix it? You tuned it?" he asked by ear. Alina nodded slightly. "Yes, sir. The tuner was not here. I know a little about pianos. My father taught me." Mr. Sterling let out a long breath that he seemed to have been holding for a long time. He walked past Alina and climbed up the steps onto the stage. He stood by the piano, looking at it as if it were a holy object. Then he turned back to look at her. "Alina," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the hall. "I have been running this school for 30 years. I have heard thousands of students play. I have heard the best players in the world come through these doors. But I have never," he paused, searching for the words, "I have never heard anything like that in my life. That wasn't just playing notes. That was power." Alina felt her face burn with heat. She wasn't used to compliments, especially not from important men. She just wanted to disappear. "It was nothing, sir," she said. "Just an old woman dreaming?" "It was not nothing," Mr. DuPont said firmly. He walked up to her. There was no disgust in his eyes when he looked at her uniform anymore. There was only respect. "I heard you from the hallway outside. I thought we had a famous guest artist hiding in the building. I didn't believe it when Sterling said it was the cleaner." Lena looked up at him, surprised. "You heard the emotion?" "We felt it," Mr. Sterling said from the stage. "It was raw. It was real. It was full of pain and life." He looked at his hands, then back at her. "Alina, where did you learn to play like that? Who are you?" This was the question she had been afraid of for 20 years. She looked at these two powerful men, and for the first time she realized she didn't have to be afraid. She looked down at her rough, scarred hands. She remembered the way the keys had felt under her fingers just a few minutes ago. She remembered the feeling of being alive. "I am nobody," she said quietly. But then she shook her head. "No, that is a lie. Long ago in my home country, I was a teacher. I played concerts. But when the war came, I had to leave. I left my piano. I left my name. I came here, and I had to work. I had to survive." She took a deep breath. "I promised myself I would not play again. I thought the music was dead inside me. But tonight, I just wanted to help the piano." Mr. Sterling walked back down the stairs to her. He didn't look at her like a janitor anymore. He looked at her like a colleague. "Alina," he said gently, "the showcase is tomorrow night. The students are ready, but something is missing. They have the technique, but they don't have the soul. They are nervous. They are playing to win, not to play." He paused, and Alina could see a crazy idea forming in his eyes. "We have an opening act before the competition starts. Usually, it is a speech or a faculty performance. But the faculty performer broke his arm last week. We have nothing." Alina shook her head quickly. She knew where he was going, and she wanted to run away. "Oh no, sir, please, I cannot." "Why not?" Mr. DuPont asked. "You have more talent in your little finger than every student in this building combined. Look at me." Alina cried out, gesturing to her uniform. "I clean the floors. I am not a performer anymore. I am old. I am tired. What would people think? They would think they are witnessing a miracle," Mr. Sterling said firmly. "Alina, listen to me. You are hiding a light that belongs to the world. You cannot clean it away. You have revealed your true power tonight. You cannot put it back in the bottle." "It is too scary," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I am just Alina." "Just Alina is exactly who we need," Mr. Sterling said. He reached out and gently touched her shoulder. It was a kind gesture, a human touch that she hadn't felt in years. "Come back tomorrow night. Not as the cleaner, as a musician. Wear what you want. Play what you want. Show these students what music really is." Lena stood there, trapped between her fear and the sudden hope that was blooming in her chest. She looked at the piano on the stage. It sat there, silent and waiting. It felt like a friend asking her to dance. She thought about the students. She thought about Victor and his angry playing. She thought about the girl who played like a robot. She realized then that Mr. Sterling was right. She had something they needed to see. She had a lesson that wasn't in any textbook. She looked at the two men. They were waiting for her answer. They weren't ordering her. They were begging her. Alina took a deep, shaky breath. She wiped her eyes on her sleeve and stood up a little straighter. The fear was still there, clawing at her stomach, but underneath it was a tiny spark of courage. "If I do this," she said slowly, "I do it for the music. Not for applause. And I do not have a fancy dress. I will come as I am." Mr. Sterling smiled. It was a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. Alina nodded once. She turned and walked toward the exit, her heart beating a new rhythm. It wasn't the rhythm of a scared janitor anymore. It was the rhythm of a woman who was about to step back into the light. She pushed the door open and walked out into the night, leaving the two men standing in the awe of the silence she had created. The night of the Golden Key showcase arrived. The conservatory was buzzing with a different kind of energy than usual. The lobby was filled with people dressed in their finest clothes. The men wore tuxedos and the women wore sparkling gowns that rustled when they walked. There was a smell of expensive perfume in the air, mixed with the scent of fresh flowers that had been arranged in giant vases near the entrance. Everyone was holding a fancy program, fanning themselves and talking in hushed, excited voices about who they thought would win the big scholarship backstage. However, the atmosphere was thick enough to cut with a knife. The students were pacing back and forth, running their scales on tabletops or shaking their hands to loosen their fingers. They were pale with nerves. Some looked like they might be sick. For them, this was the most important night of their lives. They were thinking about the judges, the scholarship, and their careers. They were carrying the weight of the world on their young shoulders, in a corner far away from the spotlight. Alina sat on a wooden crate. She did not have a dressing room. She was still wearing her work uniform. The light blue fabric was clean and pressed, but it looked out of place amidst the black tails and colorful dresses of the performers. On her feet, she still wore her sturdy brown work shoes. She had pulled the scarf off her head, letting her gray hair fall loose around her face. She looked at her hands in her lap. They were shaking slightly, so she clasped them together tightly to make them stop. Is she really going to do it? A student whispered loudly to a friend nearby. The janitor? This has to be a joke. Maybe it's a prank, the other student whispered back, giggling nervously. Maybe Mr. Sterling is trying to teach us a lesson about humility or something. Alina heard them. She didn't look up. She just took a deep breath and closed her eyes. She wasn't doing this for them. She wasn't doing this to prove them wrong. She was doing this because the music had asked her to, and because Mr. Sterling had looked at her with such hope in his eyes. She was doing it for the girl she used to be, for the woman she had become. A few minutes later, the house lights in the concert hall dimmed. The murmuring of the crowd faded into a low hum. Mr. Sterling walked out onto the stage to the sound of polite applause. He stood at the podium, adjusting his microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice booming through the hall, "welcome to the Golden Key Showcase. Tonight, we have many brilliant young performers for you. But before we begin the competition, we have a very special opening act. A member of our own family who wishes to remain anonymous will play for us. Please welcome Alina." There was a confused ripple of murmurs through the crowd. "Alina? Who is Alina?" people asked. Some thought it was a visiting celebrity they hadn't heard of. The students backstage held their breath, waiting to see what would happen. Alina stood up. Her legs felt heavy, like lead weights. She walked toward the stage door. The stage manager gave her a nod, his face neutral. She stepped out into the bright lights. The glare was blinding. She couldn't see the audience. She could only feel them. A wall of sound hit Hertha, shuffling of feet, the low coughs, the whispers of 1,000 people. She saw a sea of indistinct shapes in the darkness. She stood there for a moment, a small woman in a blue cleaner's uniform, standing center stage in front of a massive golden curtain. A few people clapped politely, but mostly there was confusion. Then she walked toward the piano. She didn't stride with the confidence of a star. She walked with the slow, steady pace of a worker going to her job. She sat down on the bench. She adjusted the height. She paused. She placed her hands on the keys. The silence in the hall was absolute. It was a nervous, skeptical silence. People were waiting for a mistake, waiting for a joke. Alina didn't play a note. She closed her eyes and listened to the silence. She let the fear wash over her and then flow away. She forgot about the uniform. She forgot about the judges. She wasn't the cleaning lady anymore. She was a vessel for the sound. Then she struck the first chord. It wasn't a quiet chord. It was a declaration. A deep, resonant sound that seemed to pierce through the dust of the concert hall and grab the audience by the throat. The whispers stopped instantly. Every head in the room snapped forward. Alina began to play. She chose a piece that was simple on paper, but incredibly difficult to play with true emotion. It was a piece that required not just speed, but a deep, aching soul. As her fingers moved, the sound that poured out of the piano was like a river breaking through a dam. It was raw, and it was honest. She played with a strength that no one expected. Her hands, usually rough and careful, were now powerful instruments of expression. She dug into the keys, pulling out a sound that was rich and warm and full of color. She wasn't showing off how fast she could play. She was telling a story. She played about the hard work she had done for 20 years. She played about the cold nights and the hot days. She played about the people who ignored her and the people who were kind to her. The audience sat transfixed. The skeptical looks vanished from their faces, replaced by awe. The fancy ladies in the front row stopped checking their jewelry. The important men in the boxes leaned forward in their seats. They stopped seeing a janitor. They saw a master. They saw a woman who had lived 1,000 lives and poured all of that pain and joy into the music. Backstage, students were crowded around the monitors, their mouths open. Victor, the talented prodigy, stood still. He watched Alina's hands on the screen. He saw that she wasn't struggling with the notes. She was commanding them. He realized that for all his technical perfection, he had never made the piano sound like that. He had never made the piano weep. For the first time, he understood what he was missing. It wasn't about the notes. It was about the heart. Alina reached the climax of the piece. The music swelled, filling every corner of the vast hall. It was a sound of triumph, a shout of existence. It was as if she was saying to the world, "I am here. I matter." Her body swayed with the music, her face lifted to the lights, tears streaming down her cheeks, unnoticed, and then, suddenly as it had begun, the storm passed. She played the final few notes, soft and gentle, like a lullaby. Her hands lifted from the keys, and the last note hung in the air. Shimmering in the silence, Alina sat there, hands hovering over the keys, her chest heaving. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was full of emotion. It was the silence of 1,000 people holding their breath because they didn't want to break the spell. Slowly, Alina lowered her hands to her lap. She stood up. She didn't bow like a performer. She just stood there, looking at the audience, her face vulnerable and open. Then, a sound started in the back row. It was clapping. One person. Then 2. Then 10. Suddenly, the entire hall erupted. It wasn't just polite applause anymore. It was a roar. People stood up. They shouted bravo. Some people were crying. The applause was deafening, a wave of sound crashing over the stage. It was a kind of applause usually reserved for legends. For the great masters of the past, Alina looked out at the standing ovation. For a second, she looked scared, like a child lost in a crowd. But then she smiled. It was a small, genuine smile that lit up her face. She gave a shy little nod, a thank you to the music and to the people who listened. She turned and walked off the stage, her squeaking shoes barely audible over the thunderous noise. When she got backstage, the students were silent. They moved aside to let her pass, but they didn't look through her this time. They looked at her with reverence. Victor stepped forward. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her with eyes full of respect and nodded slowly. Mr. Sterling was waiting for her in the wings. He was beaming, tears shining in his eyes. He didn't offer her a job or a recording contract. He didn't treat her like a product to be sold. He just took her rough, calloused hand in his and squeezed it. "Thank you, Alina," he said simply. Alina looked back at the stage curtain where the applause was still echoing. She felt lighter than she had in 20 years. The secret was out. The disguise was gone. She realized she didn't need a spotlight to feel powerful, and she didn't need a gown to be beautiful. She had shared her soul, and the world had embraced her. She straightened her blue uniform, smoothed down her hair, and smiled. "You are welcome," she said softly. "Now, I think I have a floor to mop." And as she walked away to the supply closet, she didn't feel like a ghost anymore. She walked with the rhythm of the music still humming in her veins, knowing that she was, and always had been, a true artist.